Introduction to the Old Testament, Unit 13, David and Solomon. We'll be dealing in Part 1 with 2 Samuel and the ministry of David as king, and then we will shift to Part 2 where we'll deal with Solomon and his reign. Now we learn in the first part of 2 Samuel that Saul has died. We've been told that at the end of 1 Samuel. And that David returned after defeating the Amalekites. So he is in Ziklag. It says that on the third day, a man arrived from Saul's camp with his clothes torn and with dust on his head. He came to bring a message to David. But this does not correspond to what we read at the end of 1 Samuel. There we are told that Saul fell on his sword and killed himself. Now in this case we have an Amalekite who comes to David, and he says that he was on Mount Gilboa near Saul, and Saul had been wounded, and he wanted this Amalekite to kill him. So the Amalekite did this. I stood over him and killed him because I knew that after he had fallen, he could not survive. And I took the crown that was on his head and the band on his arm and have brought them here to my Lord. So he has evidence of this. Well, David has this idea that you never touch the Lord's anointed. And so when this man says that he has killed Saul, then David in turn kills him. Your own mouth testified against you when you said, I killed the Lord's anointed. Then David has a lament for Saul and Jonathan. He had a very good relationship with Jonathan. He loved him. Jonathan loved him also. And it says that David took up this lament concerning Saul and his son Jonathan, and ordered that the men of Judah be taught this lament of the bow. It is written in the book of Jasher. Now we've seen a reference to Jasher before in the time of Joshua when the sun stood still. That is recorded in the book of Jasher. And he mentions here, verse 21, O mountains of Gilboa, may you have neither dew nor rain, nor fields that yield offerings of grain. For there the shield of the mighty was defiled, the shield of Saul, no longer rubbed with oil. Fortunately, this word of David here does not last very long, because on Mount Gilboa this is a very fertile area, and so it soon produced the crops that it should. In verse 23 it says, Saul and Jonathan, in life they were loved and gracious, and in death they were not parted. They were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lions. So you say good things about them in this eulogy that speaks about their death. And then David is anointed king over Judah. In chapter 2 of 2 Samuel, David inquired of the Lord, shall I go up to one of the towns of Judah? The Lord said, go up. David asked, where shall I go? To Hebron, the Lord answered. So David went up there with his two wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel, and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. David also took the men who were with him, each with his family, and they settled in Hebron and its towns. And then the men of Judah came to Hebron, and there they anointed David over the house of Judah. So we really have two kingdoms now, David ruling over Judah, and Ishbosheth, a son of Saul, ruling over the kingdom that we would call Israel. and there is a civil war that takes place between these. There is a description of what took place at Gibeon. Abner, son of Ner, now Abner is the general of the army of Saul, is with the men of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, left Mahanaim and went to Gibeon. Joab, son of Zeruiah, and David's men went out and met them at the pool of Gibeon. One group sat down on one side of the pool and one group on the other. And then it is suggested that they choose 12 men from each side and have them participate in hand-to-hand combat. This is useless because it says that each man grabbed his opponent by the beard and stuck his dagger into his side. And so you have 24 men that die, and nothing is accomplished. The three sons of Zeruiah, Joab, Abishai, and Asahel. And Asahel, it mentions, was as fleet-footed as a wild gazelle. The forces of David under Joab began to fight against Abner and pursue them, and Asahel went after Abner. He was going to try to kill him and gain renown for himself. Well, Abner realized that Asahel was trying to do this, and so at least on 2 occasions he told him to don't follow me, go after somebody else. And in chapter 2, verse 21, Abner said to him, turn aside to the right or to the left, take on one of the young men and strip him of his weapons. But Asahel would not stop chasing him. And then Abner warned him again, but he still pursued him. In verse 23, but Asahel refused to give up the pursuit, so Abner thrust the butt of his spear into Asahel's stomach, and the spear came out through his back. He fell here and died on the spot. Now this is going to cause trouble, because Asahel is the brother of Joab, and Joab wants revenge. Even though Asahel is killed in battle, Joab is going to take it personally. And then they continued the pursuit of Saul's forces, or I should say Ishbosheth's forces. Now they finally took a stand on the top of a hill, and then in verse 26 it says, Abner called out to Joab, must the sword devour forever? Don't you realize that this will end in bitterness? How long before you order your men to stop pursuing their brothers? So there's sort of a truce takes place. And Abner goes home to the Transjordan area of Mahanaim, and Joab continues on until he is with David in Hebron. In chapter 3, the war between the house of Saul and the house of David lasted a long time. David grew stronger and stronger, while the house of Saul grew weaker and weaker. And then we're told of the sons that were born to David in Hebron. These are important ones. The first one was Amnon, the son of Ahinoam of Jezreel. The second, Chileab, the son of Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. And we don't hear anything else about Chileab, so we assume that he must have died when he was a young child. The third, Absalom, the son of Maacah, daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur. And the fourth, Adonijah, the son of Haggith. Now those are the ones that are going to play an important part in the succession of David. Finally, Abner is accused by Ishbosheth of having sexual relations with one of the concubines of Saul. And Abner then decides that he is going to turn the kingdom over to David. He goes to David at Hebron, and he makes plans to convince the northern tribes that they should anoint David as their king. Abner leaves David, and Joab comes back from one of his expeditions and realizes that Abner had been there, and David let him go free. Well, Joab can't stand that, and so he sends after Abner and brings him back, and then he takes him aside and kills him, stabs him in the stomach. Now this is done in cold blood. Asahel, the brother of Joab, was killed in battle, but Joab takes it personally and kills Abner. David wants to make a break between himself and Joab. In verse 31 of chapter 3, he says, David said to Joab and all the people with him, "Tear your clothes and put on sackcloth and walk in mourning in front of Abner." King David himself walked behind the bier. They buried Abner in Hebron, and the king wept aloud at Abner's tomb. All the people wept also. And then there is a lament for Abner. Should Abner have died as the lawless die? Your hands were not bound. Your feet were not fettered. You fell as one falls before wicked men. And then all the people wept again. Then the text turns to Ishbosheth, who is the son of Saul. When he heard that Abner had died in Hebron, he lost his courage. Saul's son had two men who were leaders of raiding bands, and these two men came to where Ishbosheth was, and Ishbosheth was taking a nap, and this is common to do in the early afternoon. It is sort of a siesta. They went into the house as though they were after something, and they killed Ishbosheth. They cut off his head and took his head to David. It says that one was named Baanah and the other Rechab. They were sons of Rimmon. They went to David with this information. In verse 8, they brought the head of Ishbosheth to David at Hebron and said to the king, "Here is the head of Ishbosheth, son of Saul, your enemy, who tried to take your life. This day the Lord has avenged my lord the king against Saul and his offspring." Now, of course, this is similar to the message that was brought by the Amalekite that he had killed Saul. And so these two men are executed. And it says they cut off their hands and feet and hung the bodies by the pool in Hebron. But they took the head of Ishbosheth and buried it in Abner's tomb at Hebron. Then David is going to become the king of both the northern tribes and the tribe of Judah. But Hebron is in the south. It's not a good area to rule all of the tribes. So David chooses the city of Jebus, or Jerusalem, and captures the city. In chapter 5, verse 7, says, "Nevertheless, David captured the fortress of Zion, the city of David." Now, the people of Jerusalem didn't think that David would be able to take the city. And David said, "Anyone who conquers the Jebusites will have to use the water shaft to reach those lame and blind who are David's enemies. Joab is the one who led the battle against Jerusalem, and so he then becomes officially the head of David's army. Then in verse 13 it says, after he left Hebron, David took more concubines and wives in Jerusalem, and more sons and daughters were born to him. These are the names of the children. There's Shammua, Shobab, Nathan, Solomon, Ibhar, Elishua, Nepheg, Japhia, Elishama, Eliada, and Eliphelet. Now there is only one of those, and that is Solomon, who is going to play a role. Moses warned about kings taking many wives, but David took more, and then we'll find that his son Solomon took even more. And this is not good, because you always have rivalry between the sons of the king. When David is made king of both the north and the south, the Philistines come and they want to destroy him. So in chapter 5, verse 17, when the Philistines heard that David had been anointed king over Israel, they went up in full force to search for him. But David heard about it and went down to the stronghold. Now the Philistines had come and spread out in the valley of Rephaim. So David inquired of the Lord, shall I go and attack the Philistines? Will you hand them over to me? And the Lord answered, go, for I will surely hand the Philistines over to you. So it said that David went to Baal Perazim, and there he defeated them. And it says, as water breaks out, the Lord has broken out against my enemies before me. So the place was called Baal Perazim. The Philistines abandoned their idols, and David and his men carried them off. And once more the Philistines came up into the valley of Rephaim. David inquired, should he go against them? And the Lord says, yes, but don't do it the same way. This time, go around to the other side. And when you hear the sound of marching in the top of the trees, then attack the Philistines. So in verse 25, it says, David did as the Lord commanded him, and he struck down the Philistines all the way from Gibeon to Gezer. So David now wants to bring the ark into the city of Jerusalem. Remember, the ark had been captured by the Philistines, and there was a plague that broke out in a couple of the cities. They didn't want to keep it. They sent it back to the Israelites, and the Israelites sacrificed the oxen and cut up the cart for firewood. And then it says that several of them looked into the ark, and they were killed. So they sent the ark to Kiriath Yearim. Yet the ark has been at Kiriath Yearim for all of the time of Saul's reign. And David now wants to bring it to Jerusalem. And he chose men, 30,000, and they set out from Baalah of Judah to bring up from there the ark of God. They put it on a new cart, and there were two sons of Abinadab, Uzzah and Ahio. They were guiding the cart. And it says that when they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah reached out and took hold of the ark of God because the oxen stumbled. The Lord's anger burned against Uzzah, and he was killed. Because of this, David did not bring the ark into Jerusalem. It was sent to the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite. The ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite, for 3 months. And the Lord blessed him and his entire household. So this proves to David that God is still on his side. And so now he goes to bring the ark into Jerusalem, and this time they do it properly. The ark is supposed to be carried on the shoulders of the Levites. And so this is what is done. They rejoiced, they sacrificed a bull and a fattened calf, and David danced before the ark. In verse 16 of chapter 6, as the ark of the Lord was entering the city of David, Michal, daughter of Saul, watched from a window. And when she saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, she despised him in her heart. As a result of this, she is cut off from David, and she has no children. So they brought the ark of the Lord, set it in its place inside the tent that David had pitched for it. Now the rest of the tabernacle was at Gibeon, but the ark is now inside the city of Jerusalem. In verse 20, when David returned home to bless his household, Michal, daughter of Saul, came out to meet him and said, "How the king of Israel has distinguished himself today, disrobing in the sight of the slave girls of his servants, as any vulgar fellow would." And that caused a breach between David and Michal. And then we have God's promise made to David. Said to Nathan, "Here am I living in a palace of cedar, while the ark of God remains in a tent." So Nathan says, well, go ahead and do whatever you want to. But that night, God appeared to Nathan, and he tells him, "Tell David, you are not the one that is going to build my house. You are a man of war, a man of blood. Your son will build the house, but I will build a house for you." So the promise is for a dynasty that will last. In verse 11, it says that the Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. When your days are over and you rest with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, who will come from your own body, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. So that is the promise to David of an enduring kingdom. Now, part of that is going to be symbolic in the sense that the son of David is Jesus, and he will continue the kingdom in the New Testament. And when he comes back as Messiah, he comes back as the son of David. And David has a prayer. He thanks God for what he has done. And part of it in verse 28, "O sovereign Lord, you are God. Your words are trustworthy, and you have given this good promise to your servant. Now be pleased to bless the house of your servant, that it may continue forever in your sight. For you, O sovereign Lord, have spoken, and with your blessing the house of your servant will be blessed forever." And then we have a record of David's victories. It says in chapter 8, he defeated the Philistines. He took Metheg-Ammah from the control of the Philistines. He defeated the Moabites. And David fought Hadadezer, son of Rehob, king of Zobah, when he went to restore his control along the Euphrates River. And David captured 1,000 of his chariots, 7,000 charioteers, and 20,000 foot soldiers. He hamstrung all but 100 of the chariot horses. And then you have Arameans from Damascus that come to help Hadadezer, and David struck down 22,000 of them. And David put garrisons in the Aramean kingdom of Damascus. So he begins to expand his kingdom. Verse 9, when Tou, king of Hamath, heard that David had defeated the entire army of Hadadezer, he sent his son Joram to King David to greet him and congratulate him on his victory in battle over Hadadezer, who had been at war with Tou. And all of the articles that David captured as booty from this went into the house of the Lord. David became famous after he returned from striking down 18,000 Edomites in the Valley of Salt. He put garrisons throughout Edom, and all the Edomites became subject to David. The Lord gave David victory everywhere he went. And then David inquires, is there anyone left from the house of Saul to whom he can show mercy? And he is told about Mephibosheth. And Mephibosheth was a young boy of about 5 years of age when his nurse took him. When Saul was defeated, she dropped him and his legs were hurt. So he was crippled. So David now took him and brought him into his own house, and Mephibosheth ate at David's table. All of the property that Saul had was now given to Mephibosheth. And then David defeats the Ammonites in chapter 10, and this is where David had sent messengers to give condolences to the king because of the death of his father. But those who were advising the new king said they really came to find out how to attack you. And so they mistreated the messengers, cut off their beards or half of their beards and their garments at the buttocks. David told them to stay in Jericho until their beards grew out and then come back to Jerusalem. Well, David then has problems with the Ammonites because of what they have done. And even though they call in reinforcements to those in the north, David defeats them. In verse 17 of chapter 10, when David was told of this, he gathered all Israel, crossed the Jordan, and went to Helam. The Arameans formed their battle lines to meet David and fought against him, but they fled before Israel, and David killed 700 of their charioteers and 40,000 of their foot soldiers. He also struck down Shobach, the commander of their army, and he died there. When all the kings who were vassals of Hadadezer saw that they had been defeated by Israel, they made peace with the Israelites and became subject to them. So the Arameans were afraid to help the Ammonites anymore. Now, up until this time, David had been successful in all he did. Now we're coming to the sin of David with Bathsheba. This is the apex. From here, everything goes downhill. In chapter 11, in the spring, when kings go forth to war, David stayed in Jerusalem, and he got up and noticed a woman bathing on the property next door. She was a beautiful woman, and he inquired about her, sent for her, and had sexual relations with her. This was Bathsheba, and she was the wife of Uriah the Hittite. She then sent word to David that she was pregnant as a result of this. And so David had to try to cover this up. So he sent for Uriah and brought him home. He was home for several days, but he never went to his home. He slept with the servants of David at the palace. So David sent word to Joab to have Uriah killed. And when Uriah is killed, Bathsheba becomes a widow, and David then takes her as his wife. Now, this is a very important sin on the part of David. After this, David cannot correct his own family when they do sexual sins, because look at what he has already done. Chapter 12, Nathan came to David and told him a story about a rich man and a poor man. The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle. The poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb he had bought. He raised it. It grew up with him and his children. It shared his food, drank from his cup, and even slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. But the rich man had a guest that came to him, and instead of taking one of his many sheep, he took the one sheep of this poor man and killed it and fed it to his guest. David is upset. He says, "This man shall die." And then Nathan tells him, "You're the man." Well, David is contrite because of what he has done. The child that is born to Bathsheba becomes sick, and David lies on the ground, implores God that he will heal the child. He fasts, he doesn't eat anything, and after, I believe it's 7 days, he noticed the servants whispering, and he realizes the child is dead. So now he gets up, he eats, he goes about his business, because he said, it may have been that the Lord would spare the child, but he didn't. So now David will see the child in the afterlife. He says in chapter 12, verse 22, "While the child was still alive, I fasted and wept. I thought, who knows, the Lord may be gracious to me and let the child live. But now that he is dead, why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, but he will not return to me." Then it says that David comforted Bathsheba, and they had relations again, and she gave birth to a son and named him Solomon. This pleased the Lord, and so the Lord named him Jedediah, which means loved by the Lord. In verse 26 of chapter 12, it says, "Meanwhile, Joab fought against Rabbah of the Ammonites and captured the royal citadel. Joab then sent messengers to David, saying, I have fought against Rabbah and taken its water supply. Now muster the rest of the troops and besiege the city and capture it. Otherwise, I will take the city, and it will be named after me." Now this is where Uriah had been killed. And so David took his army to Rabbah and was successful in taking the town. And David and his entire army returned to Jerusalem. Now this is where everything falls apart for David. In chapter 13, we have his oldest son, who would probably have been the successor to David. He fell in love with his half-sister Tamar, the beautiful sister of Absalom, son of David. He has a friend who suggests to him that he pretend that he's sick and then ask David to have Tamar come and prepare a special meal for him. David has Tamar do this, and then when Tamar and Ammon are alone, he rapes her. She is not strong enough to resist him. And then when he has raped her, then he hates her as much as he loved her before. So he throws her out. In verse 20, her brother Absalom said to her, "Has that Amnon, your brother, been with you? Be quiet now, my sister. He is your brother. Don't take this thing to heart." But why not take it to heart? She's ruined. But Absalom decides he is going to kill Amnon. And so 2 years later, notice how long he is planning this. In chapter 13, verse 23, when Absalom's sheep shearers were at Baal Hazor, near the border of Ephraim, he invited all the king's sons to come there. He invites the king to come, but David doesn't come. He urges him to send Amnon, so he does. And then in verse 28, Absalom ordered his men, "Listen, when Amnon is in high spirits from drinking wine, and I say to you, strike Amnon down, then kill him. Don't be afraid. Have I not given you this order? Be strong and brave." So this is what he does. Amnon is killed. All of the rest of the brothers hurry back to Jerusalem, and David is first informed that Absalom has killed all of them. But the one who had advised Amnon how to rape Tamar is the one who says, "No, they're not all dead. It's just Amnon." Absalom goes to his mother's home in the north and stays there. But David wants Absalom to come back, and Joab knows this. And so he hires a woman from Tekoa to pretend to be a widow with 2 sons. In chapter 14, verse 6, "I, your servant, had 2 sons. They got into a fight with each other in the field, and no one was there to separate them. One struck the other and killed him. Now the whole clan has risen up against your servant. They say, 'Hand over the one who struck his brother down, so that we may put him to death for the life of his brother, whom he killed. Then we will get rid of the heir as well.'" So she realizes she won't have any sons left. And so she appeals to the king, and the king says he will take care of the matter. But then he asks the woman, "Has Joab had anything to do with this?" And she admits that he did. Verse 13, the woman said, "Why then have you devised a thing like this against the people of God?" When the king says this, does he not convict himself? For the king has not brought back his banished son. And so she wants Absalom to be brought back from where he has gone. So David brings him back, but David won't see him. And this is terrible because David hasn't forgiven Absalom for what he has done. It just creates more problem. In chapter 14, verse 28, Absalom lived 2 years in Jerusalem without seeing the king's face. And then he sends for Joab in order to send him to the king, but Joab refused. And so Absalom had his servants set Joab's field on fire. And when Joab came to inquire about that. And then Absalom told him he needs to go to the king so that he can see the king. In verse 33, Joab went to the king and told him this. Then the king summoned Absalom, and he came in and bowed down with his face to the ground before the king. And the king kissed Absalom. But then Absalom begins to prepare for rebellion. He wins the heart of the people. In chapter 15, Absalom provided himself with a chariot and horses and with 50 men to run before him. He would get up early, stand by the side of the road leading to the city gate. Whenever anyone came with a complaint to be placed before the king for a decision, Absalom would call out to him, "What town are you from?" He would answer, "Your servant is from one of the towns of Israel." Then Absalom would say to him, "Look, your claims are valid and proper, but there is no representative of the king to hear you." And Absalom would add, "If only I were appointed judge in the land, then everyone who has a complaint or case could come to me, and I would see that he gets justice." So this is the way he wins the heart of the people. And then at the end of 4 years, in verse 7, he asked King David, "Let me go to Hebron and fulfill a vow I made to the Lord." And so David tells him to go in peace. Absalom goes to Hebron. He gathers a group around him. Many of the people who went with him were not aware of what he planned to do. But then in verse 10, Absalom sent secret messengers throughout the tribes of Israel to say, "As soon as you hear the sound of the trumpets, then say, 'Absalom is king in Hebron.'" 200 men from Jerusalem had accompanied Absalom. They had been invited as guests and went quite innocently, knowing nothing about the matter. And then Absalom sent for Ahithophel, the Gileonite, who was a person who advised King David. Ahithophel was a grandfather of Bathsheba. And so it may be that he had a grudge against David. Then David is informed that the people have gone over to Absalom. He is approaching Jerusalem. And then David said, "We have to leave." So he and his followers left Jerusalem, went across the Jordan to stay there. Absalom comes to Jerusalem, and he has the advice of Ahithophel. Hushai the Archite is a counselor of David. David told him to go back and see if he could confound the advice of Ahithophel. Hushai went to Absalom and said he would serve him just as he had served David. And then Ahithophel suggested that one of the ways Absalom should show his break with David is to have sexual relations with the concubines that David had left at the palace. Now, while David and his forces are going up the Mount of Olives and then across the Jordan, Ahithophel told Absalom, "Lie with your father's concubines." This is in chapter 16, verse 21. "Lie with your father's concubines, whom he left to take care of the palace. Then all Israel will hear that you have made yourself a stench in your father's nostrils, and the hands of everyone with you will be strengthened." And so this is what he did. He set up some tents on the roof of the palace and had sexual relations with the concubines. Now, David is fleeing from Jerusalem, and in chapter 15, Beginning with verse 13, it tells all of those who are going with David. And David has a couple of young men, Ahimaaz, son of Zadok, Jonathan, son of Abiathar, who are supposed to bring him information about what Absalom has decided to do. And that information comes in chapter 17. It says, Ahithophel said to Absalom, I would choose 12,000 men and set out tonight in pursuit of David. I would attack him when he is weary and weak. I would strike him with terror, and then all the people with him will flee. I would strike down only the king and bring all the people back to you. The death of the man you seek will mean the return of all. All the people will be unharmed. And this plan seemed good to Absalom and to all the elders of Israel. And if Absalom had followed this advice, he probably would have been successful. But he goes to Hushai, and Absalom says in chapter 17, verse 5, Ahithophel has given this advice. Hushai in verse 7 says, the advice Ahithophel has given is not good this time. And he explains that David is a fighter and is as fierce as a wild bear robbed of her cubs. He's an experienced fighter. He will not spend the night with his troops. And so what you need to do is to gather a huge army from Dan to Beersheba and then go after him. And you lead the men. And then in verse 14 it says, the advice of Hushai the Archite is better than that of Ahithophel. For the Lord has determined to frustrate the good advice of Ahithophel in order to bring disaster on Absalom. So that word is brought to David. He crosses over the Jordan River, and he has help from some of those who are living in that area. In verse 27 of chapter 17, it says, David came to Mahanaim, Shobi, son of Nahash from Rabbah of the Ammonites, and Machir, son of Aminiel from Lodabar, and Barzillai, the Gilead from Rogalim, brought bedding and bowls and articles of pottery. They brought wheat and barley, flour and roasted grain, beans and lentils, honey, curds and sheep, and cheese from cow's milk for David and his people. So they're well taken care of by these people who live in Transjordan. In chapter 18, we are told about Absalom leading his men across the Jordan against David. This is a very difficult area in which to fight. There are so many trees, there are so many ravines, and it's said that more are killed by the terrain than died by the hand of David's men. David wants to go out and fight against Absalom, but they do not allow him to do that. He is to stay in the city. But David wants his 3 army divisions to be careful with Absalom. Then in verse 18, verse 9, Absalom happened to meet David's men. He was riding his mule, and as the mule went under the thick branches of a large oak, Absalom's head got caught in the tree. Now, we've been told earlier that Absalom was a very handsome man. He had a beautiful head of hair. He cut that hair once a year, and it amounted to several pounds of hair. Well, now his head is caught in the tree, and his beast that he is riding goes out from underneath him, and he was hanging there. He is discovered by one of the men of David. He says to Joab, "I just saw Absalom hanging in an oak tree." And Joab says, "Why didn't you kill him?" And the man says, "I heard what David said. And if I had killed him, you wouldn't have supported me. So I will not do that." So Joab took 3 javelins and plunged them into Absalom's heart while Absalom was still alive in the oak tree. And 10 of Joab's armor bearers surrounded Absalom, struck him, and killed him. And then they threw him into a pit and covered it up with a large pile of rocks. Now it says that during his lifetime, Absalom had taken a pillar and erected it in the king's valley as a monument to himself, for he thought, "I have no son to carry on my memory of my name." He ordered the pillar after himself, and it is called Absalom's monument to this day. Now there is a pillar in the Kidron Valley that is named Absalom's pillar, but it has nothing to do with Absalom. It's from a much later time. Now the word is brought to King David that Absalom has been killed and that his army has been victorious. And when David hears that Absalom has been killed, he begins to mourn him. David is a strange person. Here Absalom has tried to kill him, but David mourns for Absalom. Says, "Oh, my son Absalom, if I had died instead of you." But remember, he had lived for several years in Jerusalem without allowing Absalom to see him. And now the king is weeping and mourning for Absalom, and here is where Joab comes in again. Joab is the psychologist that handles David. And he tells him, "Look, you're mourning your Absalom, and all of the soldiers are coming back. They feel defeated because of your attitude. Now, stop doing this and go out and greet them." And so it says the king got up, took his seat in the gateway, and when the men were told the king is sitting in the gateway, they all came before him. So David then returns to Jerusalem. Now there is a problem that arises. You have the southern kingdom of Judah that had made David king earlier, and the northern kingdom of Israel that made David king later after the death of Ishbosheth. And which one of these groups is going to bring David back? The men of Judah say, "We have more claim on him because he is from our ancestry." That is, that David belongs to the tribe of Judah. But the northern kingdom says, "No, we are more, so we have the right to bring him back." And so there is a battle that took place between them verbally, whether it is actually a physical battle or not. Now it says in chapters 19, verse 15, "The king returned and went as far as the Jordan, and the men of Judah had come to Gilgal to go out and meet the king and bring him across the Jordan." And you have Shimei. Now I haven't mentioned him, but when David was fleeing from the city of Jerusalem, Shimei came alongside and was throwing dust into the air and throwing rocks at David. Some of his men wanted to kill him then, but David said, "No, it may be that the Lord has told him to do this." Now Shimei comes to the Jordan to meet King David, and when Shimei, son of Gera, crossed the Jordan, he fell prostrate before the king. and said to him, May my Lord not hold me guilty. Do not remember how your servant did wrong on the day my lord the king left Jerusalem. May the king put it out of his mind. So Shimei is pardoned by David. Now later we'll see that he is taken care of, but at this point David does not take any action against him. The sons of Zeruiah, of course, wanted to kill him. And then David meets Mephibosheth, Saul's grandson. Now he's the one that David brought to Jerusalem, and he ate at David's table. Now the servant had gone with David across the Jordan and claimed that Mephibosheth had stayed behind, thinking that the kingdom of Saul would be given to him. Now, of course, he couldn't rule because he was lame, but that's what the servant said. Now, David realizes that there is a difficulty, and so he then gives to Mephibosheth half of the property of Saul, and to the servant the other half. Mephibosheth is willing to let the servant take everything now that the king has arrived home safely. But Barzillai, the Gileadite, also came from Rogelim to cross the Jordan with the king, sent him on his way. Barzillai was a very old man, 80 years of age. He had provided for the king during his stay at Mahanaim, for he was a very wealthy man. The king said to Barzillai, Cross over with me and stay with me in Jerusalem, and I will provide for you. But Barzillai makes an excuse. How many more years will I live that I should go to Jerusalem? I'm now 80 years old. Can I tell the difference between what is good and what is not? Can your servant taste what he eats and drinks? So he's lost his sensitivity to food. Can I still hear the voices of men and women? And he can't do that anymore. So what good would it be for him to go to Jerusalem? But he does have another servant, and that is his servant Kimham. It says, Let him cross over with my lord the king. Do for him whatever pleases you. And so the king crossed over to Gilgal, and Kimham crossed with him, and the troops of Judah and half the troops of Israel took the king over. And then we have another problem. Because of this dispute between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. Chapter 20, Now a troublemaker named Sheba, son of Bichri, a Benjamite, happened to be there. He sounded the trumpet and shouted, We have no share in David, no part in Jesse's son. Every man to his own tent, O Israel. So this is a rebellion against David by the northern tribes. So David then called his army commander. He was the one that had led the troops of Absalom. He has now appointed him as head of his own army. His name is Amasa, and he is supposed to summon the men of Judah within 3 days. He took longer than this. And so Abishai, the brother of Joab, is appointed the commander. And it says the Joab's men and the Kerethites and Pelethites and all the mighty warriors went out under the command of Abishai. They marched out from Jerusalem to pursue Sheba, son of Bichri. Now Sheba had gone north. In fact, had gone just about as far north as he could go, Abel Beth Maacah. When Abishai set out with his troops, then Amasa came. Joab decides that he doesn't like being replaced by someone else, so he kills Amasa in cold blood, stabs him in the stomach, then leads the troops north against Sheba, son of Bichri. Sheba passed through all the tribes of Israel to Abel Beth Maacah and through the entire region of the Berites. Joab came and besieged the city of Abel, and then a woman comes to the city wall and she says, "Tell Joab to come here so I can speak to him." So there is a conversation between Joab and the woman, and she says, long ago they used to say, "Get your answer at Abel," and that settled it. We are the peaceful and faithful in Israel. You are trying to destroy a city that is a mother in Israel. Why do you want to swallow up the Lord's inheritance? And then Joab says, well, I don't want to destroy the city. We're after Sheba. So she says, I'll take care of it. And so she went in and talked to the people, gave her advice. They cut off the head of Sheba, son of Bichri, and threw it to Joab. So he sounded the trumpet. His men dispersed from the city, each returning to his home. And Joab went back to the king in Jerusalem. And then it says Joab was over Israel's entire army. Now that is not what David wanted. But it says Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, was over the Kerethites and Pelethites. Those are the foreign troops that were the bodyguard of David. Adoniram was in charge of forced labor. Jehoshaphat, son of Ahilud, was recorder. Sheva was secretary. Zadok and Abiathar were priests. And Ira the Jerite was David's priest. Then we read that when Saul was reigning, he tried to wipe out those men who had made a treaty with Israel. As a result of that, there is a famine for 3 successive years. And David sought the Lord, and he found out that it is because of what Saul did when he tried to put the Gibeonites to death. And so the king summoned the Gibeonites and asked them, what can he do for them? The Gibeonites answered in verse 4, chapter 21, we have no right to demand silver or gold from Saul or his family, nor do we have the right to put anyone in Israel to death. And then David asked, what do you want me to do? And they said, give us 7 of his male descendants to be killed and exposed before the Lord at Gibeah of Saul. So David did this. He didn't take Mephibosheth because he was in the palace, but he took 7 of the sons of Saul, most of them by his concubine, Rizpah. Rizpah stayed with those who had been killed, who were exposed. She took sackcloth, spread it out for herself on a rock, and from beginning of the harvest till the rain poured down from the heavens on the bodies, she did not let the birds of the air touch them by day, or the wild animals by night. So then David took the bones of Saul and his son Jonathan from the citizens of Jabesh Gilead. He brought them to the tomb of Saul's father Kish at Zelah in Benjamin, and they were all buried there. And then it says God answered prayer in behalf of the land. Now we read that there were wars against the Philistines. Of course, this had happened in the beginning of David's reign when he became king of both kingdoms. But now he went down to fight against the Philistines. He became exhausted. And it says in chapter 21, verse 16, Abshibenob, one of the descendants of Rapha, whose bronze spearhead weighed 300 shekels, and who was armed with a new sword, said he would kill David. But Abishai, son of Zeruiah, came to David's rescue. He struck the Philistine down and killed him. Then David's men swore to him, saying, "Never again will you go out with us to battle, so that the lamp of Israel will not be extinguished." So David then did not lead the men in battle after this. But there was another battle with the Philistines at Gob, and Sebbetai, the Hushathite, killed Saph, one of the descendants of Rapha. And then another battle with the Philistines at Gob, Elhanan, son of Jaare-Oregim, the Bethlehemite, killed Goliath the Gittite, who had a spear with a shaft like a weaver's rod. We have David who killed Goliath, but now we are told that there is another fellow who killed Goliath. So there is a little bit of confusion here. In still another battle which took place at Gath, there was a huge man with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in all. He was descended from Rapha. When he taunted Israel, Jonathan, son of Shamiah, David's brother, killed him. These 4 were descendants of Rapha in Gath, and they fell at the hands of David and his men. And then David has a song of praise for all that God has done for him. The Lord had delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. And so in chapter 22, there is a psalm that goes on for the full chapter, and that praises God for the way in which he has given victory to David.